Hey guys, Manic here. I wanted to talk to you before the video started and let you know that some of these stories that I'm going to be reading here are particularly disturbing. So if that's not your thing, go ahead and click away now. I hope you enjoy. Remember to like, share, and comment if you did enjoy it. One. Worst ever for me was a guy who tortured his girlfriend's 3 small children until one died. The scene was subtle yet horrific when we started putting the pieces together. The children initially wouldn't speak about the suspect at all, and now a couple years later they only make cryptic statements like, "If I did X, he would come and do Y." It was the only time in my career I've seen a cause of death ruled as torture. 2. The earliest memorable person is a 16-year-old who killed 2 men by stabbing them in the head with a screwdriver. He was just acting the hard man in front of his mates and picked on these 2 guys for nothing. The thing that got me was his complete lack of remorse or regret. I'd never properly understood what a psychopath was until then. 3. Had a call once in a major metropolitan area during my probation period some years ago. The fire department called us for help, saying they had been threatened by a knife-wielding maniac while attempting to render aid to someone. My partner and I got there and saw the FD just standing around, so we were thinking, okay, this guy's probably gone and we'll have to just take a report for them and get our next call. That's the first time I heard the screams of someone about to die. The shrill terror in a person's voice is completely distinguishable from your everyday scream for help or yells of anger. It sends a shiver down your spine. My partner and I didn't have time for backup to arrive or make a tactical plan, so we entered an apartment complex by ourselves and followed the screams until we located a door we thought they were coming from. I kicked in the door and we entered to find the knife-wielding man stabbing a woman in the chest. Shots are fired and the man goes down. As though a scene from a movie after a shooting, backup comes running in to clear the rest of the apartment while I awkwardly handcuff this man who is bleeding all over my uniform. He's missing either his radius or ulna, one of the 2 wrist bones from a bullet shattering it. There's blood everywhere and you can smell it in the air. This is also the first time I held a person while they were dying, which isn't particularly pleasant either. The man passed shortly after in the ambulance, even with the fire department outside already. We later discovered the man was on drugs and suffered from mental illness. He had attempted to kill himself a week prior and failed, so the higher-ups believe this is how he wanted to finish himself off. 4. This was in Brooklyn. Squad called an 85 at such and such address. A neighbor had called in an assault in progress, and the detective squad happened to be on the block for another reason. They got there fast and met the perp coming out the front door. We get there a couple minutes after the perp is being walked in handcuffs to the car. I went into the house to see if everybody was okay and what the 85 was about. Long story short, perp hacked a woman and her 4 kids, infant to 12 years old, to death with a meat cleaver. Mom and the oldest were still breathing when we came in the door, but not for long after that. 3 babies were all in the back bedroom. The apartment looked pretty much like what you would imagine if you tried to imagine something like that. You could taste the blood in the air. There was so much of it. When I walked out to get a look at the perp, a detective told me, "See if you can get his name, but don't ask him anything else." Guy was seated in the back seat in handcuffs and had a look in his eye that I can't even describe here. The devil was let loose in that apartment. 5. I was a detective in the town I worked at and of course had to cover calls on a rotation. I was on call on Halloween one night and got a call about a shooting that had just occurred in a fairly decent part of the town I worked in. I was already out due to another incident and decided to head on that way, figuring if there was anything to it, I would get called anyways. Being that it was Halloween in that part of town, I, of course, thought this was just another prank call. As I'm heading to the call, dispatch advised that they are getting multiple calls and reports of multiple victims. With this, I realized this probably wasn't a prank call and actually ended up being the first person on scene. Turns out that some kids were trick-or-treating, and when they knocked on the door of this one house, the guy inside freaked out and unloaded an AK-47 through the glass door into 2 kids and the father. The kids being over 10 but less than 14. The oldest child took most of the bullets, killing him. The father and the younger child survived. I spent 3 hours interviewing the suspect. I've interviewed a lot of suspects, murderers included. And this was the most mentally and physically exhausting interview of my life. That was almost 8 years ago, and the whole thing still haunts me. 6. My partner and I chased down a kidnapper/rapist. Guy convinced a petite drunk girl to go into an alley. While back there, he beat her and tried to rape her. If she hadn't been wearing jeans, he'd have completed the act. A passerby called 911, and my partner and I stopped him less than a block away. His fly was down, and he hadn't even put his dick back in his pants. We caught a lucky break, too. The entire attack was caught on a security cam we were able to immediately obtain. Watching the video nearly made me cry on duty. With that arrest, we were able to close out 3 other sexual assaults. The guy was a serial rapist who usually preyed on homeless women. He was homeless himself. It's been 1.5 years since the arrest. We go to trial in a few weeks. I can't wait to put him behind bars for a very long time. 7. Received a call from a concerned neighbor in an apartment complex. She advised a female upstairs was screaming for help. Me and my partner conducted a knock and talk, and a very large male answered the door wearing boxers. We asked him if anyone else was in the apartment. He looked back towards the bedroom, turned and looked back at us, and paused for a second, and then said, "No." Me and my partner looked at each other, sensing something was wrong. We looked down and observed blood on the tile floor and made entry due to exigent circumstances. I spoke with the male in the living room, and I see he was getting extremely worried. He stepped back and started shouting, "Lock his ass up now!" He then tried to make a run for it. After he was detained, we returned to the room, and I saw a girl locked in a dog cage, beaten half to death. The investigation revealed he had been holding her hostage in the apartment for several months, raping her and pimping her out to sick fucks and forcing her to eat dog food. She was unable to stand. I believe both legs and arms were broken. Both eye sockets were so badly broken and bruised they swelled up over her eyes. The bed sheet, which I could only assume was once white, was completely covered in blood stains. I've been on the scene of somewhere around 100 plus murders, countless auto fatalities, and everything in between, and to this day, it's just about the only thing that gets to me. I couldn't understand how someone could be that evil. When I returned to my patrol vehicle to run their information, I looked at her driver's license photo and couldn't recognize her. That's how badly she had been beaten. I've seen her once since the incident. She is now blind in both eyes and can still hardly walk. It sucks to think about how many times I've been at that apartment building on other calls while she was locked in a cage and had probably been standing just a few feet away from her. 8. He walked into a business right at closing time when there was no customers left and only one 18-year-old female employee. At gunpoint, he took all the money that he could, then forced her to take off all her clothes and perform oral sex on him. He then took her in the back room, tied her up, and penetrated her with the barrel of his gun for several minutes before barricading the back room door so she couldn't get out and leaving her there. Turns out he was a former employee, and if you can believe it, convicted sex offender, who had made several passes at the victim while they worked together and been rejected every time. He was there to rob the place, but when he saw who was working, he figured he killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Catching him was among the more satisfying moments of my career. 9. This might be a little different, but I'm late to the party, but here it goes. A few years ago, we get sent as the second car to a family disturbance, sent as routine. Halfway there, we get updated to roll code 3 to a shots fired call at the same house. We arrived and there was a young man with what looked like a stick in his hand laying on the ground, already 0, which means dead. My partners have an older man in handcuffs in the back of their unit. After speaking to a lady, the wife, and another young man, the son, who were home, the story comes out. The family disturbance was a deceased young man breaking a chair and hitting his dad with the broken chair legs. Dad gets his gun, warns son. Son doesn't stop. Dad shoots son in the face and kills him. I will never forget the way the father looked at me in the eye and said, "I'm going to hell for this, aren't I?" 10. Had a guy who had been fucking his girlfriend's 3-year-old daughter. He found out he had gotten busted and took a whole bunch of methadone and probably anything else in the house he could get his hands on. Was found unresponsive and put in an ice bath by his friends, and one of them was nice enough to call 911. Hell of it is that when we showed up, the girlfriend is defending him, stashing contraband and trying to keep us from entering the apartment without a warrant. Exigent circumstances, hip-hop hooray, get out of my way, and we got him to the hospital. Hell of it is that while we got him flushed out, she flushed all their shit and deleted all the images from his phone of the rapes. Fucking mom, choosing her rapist boyfriend over her daughter. Lowest of the low. He pled to a lesser charge eventually due to a lack of evidence, and she caught a tampering with physical evidence charge and got her kid taken away. She's out and works at a local restaurant that I'll never go to again. 11. Cop here. I responded to a child not breathing. On arrival, I found a 2-year-old girl wearing only undies, unconscious on the cement floor. She is freezing cold, pale, foaming from the mouth, and barely breathing. I spent the next 6 hours by her side as detectives learned that the mom's boyfriend was pissed that she wouldn't stop crying, so he picked her up by the waist, over his head, and slammed her into the ground. Twice. When Mom got out of the shower, he told her she wasn't breathing right. Mom uses the girl's asthma inhaler twice and waits. An hour and a half later, she goes to her neighbor's house to use her phone to call her mom. The neighbor overhears the conversation about the baby not breathing and takes it upon herself to call 911. The girl received a basal skull fracture and caused little seizures. She vomited several times but lay on her back for over an hour. She aspirated the vomit repeatedly. For nearly 2 hours, that little girl lay on the ground with her skull bleeding into her brain, her body temp being sucked into the floor, trying to breathe the vomit. And for the next 6 hours, I sat with her and held her hand, stroked her hair, and watched her die, hoping her little brain shut down and blocked out everything that was happening. That case still makes me tear up to this day. And it was one of the 3 worst calls I've ever been on. I don't know how someone can do that to a baby. Edit. I apologize for the lack of clarity. I wrote this last night through tear-filled eyes and then went to bed. 1. Paramedics were called. They arrived seconds after I did. They did everything they could. I rode in the ambulance with her to the hospital. 2. I stayed with her the entire time because in the possible death investigation, we keep an officer with the person throughout until the medical examiner takes custody of the body. So I stayed with her in the ER, went to the CT scan with her, etc. Her little brain had been deprived of oxygen too long. There was no surgery that could save her. 3. BF fled during the initial chaos of officers and medics arriving. He was caught later that night without incident. He was charged and convicted, but that doesn't undo what he did. 4. How do you deal? That's a good one. You come home and you hug your own kids. You have a beer with the other guys that were on the scene. You realize that if it wasn't for your job, assholes like that would get away with it. and then you get in your car and you do it again tomorrow. Thanks for listening. Be good to each other.